Hey guys, where we left off in class was on the War of 1812, and we actually wrapped up the War of 1812. And what the War of 1812 brought about were a couple of things. For one, the United States gained more respect from Britain, even though no one really won the war. We are gaining more respect because we're holding our own. And also, it's this new sense of nationalism, this idea that your people and your country are in fact great. We see the development of the Star Spangled Banner. We see the emergence of two national heroes such as Andrew Jackson and uh, William Henry Harrison, also known as Tippecanoe. And so, immediately following the War of 1812, we get this span that's known as the Era of Good Feeling. And that lasts from about 1816 to 1824. Sometimes they say 1825, depending on which historian we're talking about. And what the Era of Good Feeling is a period of nationalism and virtually no political division. Keep in mind, prior to this, there were lots of clashes between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. But remember, the Federalists have lost a lot of power and a lot of influence because of what happened at the Hartford Convention. From about 1814 to 1815, those Federalists were meeting in the New England area and planning to secede from the Union, meaning they were trying to leave the United States, not as individuals, but they were actually wanting to take New England and create a whole nother country. As someone pointed out in class, that's very similar to what Aaron Burr was trying to do. I remember we had talked about Aaron Burr and questioned whether or not he might have been the worst vice president in American history. But anyhow, this lecture is going to be about the era of good feeling. Your DBQ is going to be about the era of good feeling, and you're also going to need to know a bit about nationalism as well as sectionalism. Sectionalism is chapter 9 that I provided for you on Edmodo. And so, our central question here is what were the major characteristics of the era of good feeling? And your DBQ is essentially going to be considering the era of good feeling and analyzing primary and secondary resources to determine to what extent it actually was an accurate description of that time period. Here are the election results of the election of 1816. And keep in mind, we had mentioned that the Federalists lost a lot of power. You can see the Federalists here, King, only brings in about 16% of the vote, compared to the Democratic Republican, Monroe, bringing in 84% of the vote. So James Monroe becomes president, and he'll be president from 1817 to 1825. Another Democratic Republican is in the White House. His Secretary of State, I should say, is John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is the eldest son of John Adams. One key component of the era of good feeling is this idea of expansion. Anytime we expand as a nation, we I don't know, we're just kind of feeling ourselves. We feel really good about ourselves. We feel like we're spreading our principles and our ideals that are within our founding documents, etc. So what we have here in the Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819, there are two things that take place. First of all, Spain cedes Florida to the United States. When I say cede, we're talking about they're giving that up. They're giving Florida up to the United States. And keep in mind, Florida at the time was very swampy. A lot of the settlers, particularly the Spanish, hadn't really figured out how to really live there and create really thriving communities. St. Petersburg is known as being pretty thriving. Saint Augustine was pretty thriving. A lot of the northern Florida areas were thriving. South Florida was mainly just swamp at the time. Now, in addition to giving up Florida to the United States, what the Adams-Onís Treaty also does is it creates this line. So you see this red line here? Those are the borders that separate Spanish territory, Spanish possessions from the United States, from the states as well as the U.S. territories. So again, the Adams-Onís Treaty does two things. The first thing that it does, Spain gives up Florida to the United States. It initially becomes a territory. And the second thing that it does is it separates Spanish possessions from the United States territories. Now, the American system. This is something that is developed and promoted by Henry Clay. You heard Henry Clay's name before because he was also a war hawk along with John C. Calhoun. Remember, he was the one that was saying we need to go to war with Great Britain because they're riling up the Native Americans. He's known as the Great Compromiser, and you'll continue to hear about him quite a bit in this unit. One of the first parts of the American system, and yes, you definitely need to know this, is the tariff of 1816. Anytime you see tariff, you need to know that that is a tax on imports. That is, when I say imports, those are goods that are being brought into the country. An export is leaving the country, an import is coming into the country. And so it's a tax on imports, and anytime you have a tariff, especially if it's very high, what that does is it protects American businesses. And so that's why that's an important part of the American system is that the tariff protects American businesses and American businessmen. And ultimately, by doing so, there's the idea that it will protect the American economy. Now, the second part of the American system was the chartering of the second bank of the United States. The first bank had expired. We're going to see that we need a second bank because without it, our economy is going to go through a very, very rough patch, possibly even crumble. And so the second Bank of the United States is chartered, but that's going to be a little controversial again in the future. Now, another, probably the most significant part of the American system is this idea that the federal government should pay for internal improvements. So building roads and things like that, that should be the job of the federal government, and they're the ones that need to make sure that they are willing to make those expenses. And so when I say things like, internal improvements, here's an example. This is known as the National Road, more famously known as the Cumberland Road. And you can see here it spans from Baltimore to St. Louis. All right, this idea that this long road here is going to be a very simple transport option for people that need to travel throughout this area from the East Coast all the way through some of our territories, and that is funded by the federal government. So when you think American system, think tariffs to protect American businesses, think Second National Bank, and also think internal improvements such as this Cumberland Road. The Erie Canal is developed during this time. It's about 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo. What's really, really important about the Erie Canal, though, is that typically, you see people kind of rise up around water, right? And these settlements and civilizations begin to emerge. One thing that made the Erie Canal, or I should say, one thing that the Erie Canal really led to was the heavy population, the even more dense population, I should say, of New York City. Without the Erie Canal, New York City wouldn't be the New York City that we know today. So that's just another example of internal improvement from the American system. And so when we think about the American system, with the west part of the United States, the western part of the United States, they got things like roads, canals. Um, they also received federal aid. Uh, the East, they got the backing of protective tariffs from the West. In the South, well, they didn't get a whole lot, to be honest with you. They're very critical of this American system. They think it's all about business. And so what we have here is this idea of sectionalism. Right? You're going to see more of that in Chapter 9. So while the West has roads headed out there, and to be fair, the East gets some of those things as well. The East gets roads, the East gets canals, etc. Um, but what the East mostly wants are those tariffs. All right, and so again, the American system think tariffs, the tax on imports, the internal improvements such as roads, canals, uh, the federal government paying for those things, as well as the chartering of the Second National Bank. And a lot of this is very focused on the East and the West, and not so much focused on the South. Now, in 1819, we do go through an economic crisis. This is not a crisis that is on, or I should say, that is in the curriculum framework. But you do want to be aware that anytime you see something that says the panic of, and then it has a year, what that's talking about is a depression. So, similar to how we had a Great Depression back in the 1930s and the early part of the 1940s, just back then we called it a panic because people were panicking about how poorly the economy was performing. Now, the main cause of the panic was the second bank of the United States, and one of the things that they did is they increased inflation, and they also expanded credit. So they put a lot of money in circulation in the economy, and so in doing so, what they also did is they were calling loans and they were raising the interest. And so with all this money that's out in the economy, the second bank is going to try to get some of that money back by raising the interest and bring that money back into the system, back into the banking system. And so what that does is, because the economy is kind of going all over the place between the expansion of credit and this increase in interest rates, it causes that panic. All right. The role of the national bank is to regulate the economy in such a way that they can effectively control the money supply. This is an example of the second bank, or really any bank, not effectively doing their job and trying to overcompensate in order to better control the money supply. Now, the election of 1820, Monroe runs for president again. This time, though, his former Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, runs against him for president. You can see John Quincy Adams is here as an independent Republican. Now, keep in mind, this is not the Republican Party that we know today. All right, this is just another party that emerges, a third party of sorts. Okay, now look at the electoral votes here. Monroe just kills John Quincy Adams. 99.5% of the voters voted for Monroe. 99.5. A big part of Monroe's presidency is known as the Missouri Compromise. This takes place in 1820, and what we have here is a situation where Henry Clay kind of saves the day. Remember, we called him the Great Compromiser. What happens is Missouri wants to join the United States, but they want to join the United States as a slave state. This is concerning, especially to the North, because they want to keep the balance. They want to make sure that there aren't more slave states than there are free states, because they don't want the South to have too much power. All right. And so Clay comes up with this compromise where he says, okay, Missouri can join as a slave state, but Maine will also join the United States as a free state. And so that is done in order to keep this balance between the North and the South. Now, there's also this line here. You see this 3630 line that separates the unorganized territory and what's Arkansas territory right here. Now, what we see here is a line that also separates free from slave states. And so the other part of the Missouri Compromise is that this line will basically determine whether an area will become slave, or I'm sorry, whether an area will be slave or free. So anything above this 3630 line, if it ever becomes a state, they must be free states, and anything below this line would essentially be slave states. And so this is supposed to kind of resolve this debate and resolve this concern about this, you know, this balance issue between slave and free states. Now, there's a Talmadge Amendment that is proposed, and that is proposed to say that all slaves born in Missouri after the territory becomes a state would be freed by the age of 25. All right, that is something that is done, especially by those people who are not necessarily in support of slavery. Unfortunately, though, it was passed by the House of Representatives, but it was not passed in the Senate, so it did not become law. Also, during the era of good feeling, in terms of foreign policy, uh, there's the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. This is often referred to as America's self-defense doctrine. Keep in mind, we just finished getting bullied by England and France. Now we've fought a second war for independence, which is officially called the War of 1812. And we want to make sure that we're asserting our dominance while also protecting our national security. And so the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, what that does, it says that the United States is going to remain neutral in European affairs. Basically, we're going to mind our own business. Whatever issues you guys have over there, that's your business. Number two, it says the U.S. wouldn't interfere in European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Right? So we're going to respect European colonies in this hemisphere. Number three, it says no colonization in the Western Hemisphere. What I mean by that is the British can't come over to our hemisphere and just start claiming stuff anymore. If they already have colonies, that's one thing, but they can't just come over and start claiming stuff. And this is particularly pertaining to Europeans. And number four, European control of any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be viewed as hostile. So anytime a European official comes over to our hemisphere, and if they are attempting to control people, we are going to interpret that as an act of war. So that's foreign policy. In the 1824, there's another election. Monroe has served 2 terms. Uh, and so now we're going to get into a very controversial election. If you look here at the bottom right, you see the people that are running for president. We have John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Crawford, and Henry Clay. All right. And now you can see, if you look above here, you can see the results. The top part being the electoral vote, the bottom part being the popular vote. So you can see here that Andrew Jackson actually won both the electoral vote and the popular vote. The problem is, though, that he didn't get, or that no candidate, I should say, no candidate got enough uh, electoral votes in order to become president. And so this leads to an issue of having to decide who will be president uh, without an election. Instead, this goes to Congress. And so, again, here are the numbers for the election of 1824. And this is actually a political cartoon that represents this election. All right. Now notice here that we have Andrew Jackson coming in third. Here we have John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay up front. Now, what this represents is that Andrew Jackson is the one that's screwed here. All right. He wins the popular vote. He has the most electoral votes. Because this has to go to Congress now, he's put at a disadvantage because he's not a very well liked person. Now, keep in mind, he became a national figure as a result of the War of 1812. But what we have is Henry Clay, the guy who's running for president himself and doesn't have a whole lot of support. He happens to be Speaker of the House. So when this election, when the election of 1824 goes to Congress, when it goes to the House of Representatives, what Henry Clay does is he convinces everybody in the House of Representatives to throw their support behind John Quincy Adams. And so they all select John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams will become president of the United States. So what did Henry Clay get? Right? What does Henry Clay get out of this? He gets to become a member of John Quincy Adams' cabinet. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we call the corrupt bargain. In 1824, Andrew Jackson, who is seen as someone who represents the common man, is basically robbed of an election. He wins the popular vote, he wins the electoral vote. But John Quincy Adams wanted to be president so bad, he was able to convince Henry Clay to get members of the House of Representatives to select him as president. And that's what happens, guys. Whenever we don't have a clear winner in a presidential election, the election goes to Congress. Unless there's some kind of lawsuit, then it would go to the Supreme Court if they take it up. And so ultimately, we have a man uh, that becomes president who doesn't really have full support of the American people. All right. And so in 1824, with this corrupt bargain, what it effectively does is it creates the Democratic Party. And so it kind of rings in this era known as the Jacksonian era, and also this new or forthcoming, I should say, dominance of the Democratic Party. And this is the Democratic Party that exists today. All right, now the views are probably different, but this is the same party. And so Andrew Jackson is the creator of the Democratic Party, and that happens in 1824.